Russia invades Ukraine. Who's talking about it on the news?
We should be communicating to individuals in Moscow.
Israel bombs Gaza. Who's talking about it on the news?
The
United States government wants to ban TikTok. Who's talking about it on the news? Pundits, experts, contributors, these are mainstays of not only how we as viewers consume the news, but also how the news itself is done, how it's interpreted, written, broadcasted. When we look at the coverage of the Russian war in Ukraine in particular, the various involved parties, what's at stake, what possible outcomes there are, when we look at how that war has been reported on, we find that very specific voices are picked to offer analyses. And it just so happens that these commentators, more often than not, happen to agree with one another.
Ukraine, if we give them what they need, they beat Russia every time on the battlefield.
But there are literally hundreds of new sanctions that we could impose. We should have a big bang approach to sanctions.
NATO and the U.S. have to be more aggressive. Every time we say that we will defend every square inch of NATO territory, Putin hears, well, I guess the rest is for me.
These people, the voices given authority, they matter. They matter when, like in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, the U.S. government has sent to date almost $50 billion in military assistance, despite fewer and fewer Americans supporting that kind of aid. And most of that money, by the way, never even leaves the U.S., since it goes directly to American arms manufacturers who are directly supplying Ukraine or replenishing U.S. stocks of weapons that are being sent there. And so we then have to ask, what role does the arms and defense industry itself play in pushing narratives in our coverage that are responsible for the continuation of this war? Narratives that have made weapons manufacturers a lot of profits. And where are these guys even coming from? Who picks them? How are they picked? And what relationships do they have with the stories they comment on? And who holds them accountable when they help lead a nation into bad decisions impacting hundreds of millions at home and abroad? Welcome to the military-industrial media complex. And welcome to Backspace, where we tell you how the story is told in the headlines, and then we think about how we can tell it a little differently. So in February of 2022, following years of NATO expansionism, Russia invades Ukraine and heats up a Cold War involving Europe and the United States that exacerbates global economic devastation caused by a pandemic, pushing hundreds of millions into a food crisis and fuel price-driven inflation. Still not a world war, though.
Overnight, in the capital of Ukraine, the sound of missile strikes and air sirens.
It led to a media spectacle not seen in this country since the early 2000s. It was as though the United States itself had been invaded and the entire country was at war, and everything had to be done to destroy Russia and punish all Russians.
Talking about oil and gas sanctions, they want to see this administration punish Russia even more.
You got to hit them where it hurts, and economically and financially, when American companies bolt, well, Russia hurts.
If patriotism is loving your country, everyday Ukrainians have something far greater, because they're willing to die for it.
Assets need to be seized. I wonder if Europe and America is willing to take that next step and actually hit Russia where it will hurt them the most economically.
While over a year later, the coverage has tapered in comparison to the first 6 months, the war is still reported daily in print and broadcast news. And as the Biden administration has shown, it's a political priority of U.S. leadership, even if it isn't for everyday people. But what the coverage of the Russia-Ukraine war really has also shown is the staying power of what's called the American military-industrial media complex. We know that the military-industrial complex is about the mutually beneficial relationship between the military and the defense industry. One needs arms to fight wars, the other supplies the arms for those wars. War is good for everyone's business. The military-industrial media complex adds the news media into that relationship. It's where the media and its members have financial and social ties with the military and the Washington, D.C. foreign policy establishment, and that then has an impact on coverage. That impact is manifested in different ways, from the way that foreign policy decisions are characterized.
They are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield.
To who's given the platform and authority to talk about those decisions. Consider when the Trump administration assassinated Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani in 2020. It was a shocking act of explicit aggression by the United States. And so experts, pundits, contributors, whatever we want to call them, flooded the airwaves. The Intercept, 3 days after the assassination, noted that the financial ties to the defense industry that many of these commentators had was often not disclosed by the news programs they were on, like Jack Keane, David Petraeus, John Negroponte, and Jay Johnson, ex-military and ex-public officials who all had financial ties with the defense industry.
The president had ample domestic legal authority to take him out.
The Intercept noted this again in 2021, following the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan after a 20-year occupation. Its reporters found that again and again, cable news programs brought on experts, ex-military, ex-public officials, without disclosing their professional and financial ties to defense industry. And surprise, surprise, they pushed for the Americans to stay in Afghanistan.
It's a sad, frustrating moment to watch an ill-conceived, and I emphasize ill-conceived, hasty withdrawal turn into what is now an embarrassing retreat.
By the time Joe Biden became president, I actually think he inherited a situation, Brian, which he could have lived with.
When we were there, we had the cooperation of the Afghans. We had good intelligence on where the targets were. We'll have none of that with Taliban control.
And that trend continued with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Experts are still brought in for commentary on cable news shows without the disclosure of their financial ties to the very industry with an interest in selling more and more weapons and not ending the war.
I think we have to really get serious and understand this is a long-term problem. But we can do more right now. 10 Challenger tanks, wonderful. Why not 20? Why not 40? Why not 60? 50 Bradley fighting vehicles? Why not 200?
The dedication of the tanks, that's not enough, but it's certainly a start.
They need more long-range missile systems. They need more tanks. They need more of everything we've provided and some additional weapons to try to give them the capabilities to achieve not just stalemate on the battlefield, but breakthrough.
Of course, this goes beyond cable news. Fairness and accuracy in reporting found that in the 2 days following Vladimir Putin's threats to escalate the war with an additional mobilization of 300,000 troops, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal published several articles that didn't critically engage with the aggressive direction of U.S. policy toward Russia and the war. Instead, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, like most U.S. news media, have pushed hawkish perspectives on the war. They rarely, at best, have discussed American public opinion or even Russian public opinion or looked at the role U.S. policy played in pushing the war. Additionally, there's been a systematic disregard for the consensus of the global South. Everyone from Brazil to Turkey to China have offered peace proposals.
The U.S. is warning about China's so-called peace plan for the war in Ukraine.
Ukrainian President Zelensky seemed to signal an openness to a good faith peace plan from China, and he says he hopes to meet with Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. But it remains to be seen exactly how sincere Beijing is about ensuring a peaceful resolution to this conflict.
We don't see any impetus right now to get to the negotiating table. So that's why we are focused on making sure Ukraine has everything they need to be successful on the battlefield, so that if and when President Zelensky says, I'm ready to sit down, he can do so with some wind at his back.
Many African and Asian countries oppose sanctions on Russia, and many Latin American countries have refused to bow to U.S. pressure and send ammunitions to Ukraine. These stories are ignored, despite them showing a consensus of where most of the world stands against escalation and war. Instead, the U.S. news media promotes a narrative of goals that can't be achieved without imposing military defeat on the Russian state. And that means a long and permanent war at the cost of the vulnerable in Ukraine and the global South. And so, when the only narrative being offered in headlines on cable news is one that upholds a very aggressive American foreign policy that doesn't offer alternatives to war, alternatives like diplomacy to end a costly, devastating war, what then is our news media's function? It's propaganda. It's the military-industrial media complex, and what it does in effect is use the speculative threat of something worse to whitewash and justify atrocities being committed in the name of prevention. The most classic example of this was, of course, the Iraq War, a war sold by an entire industry of experts, pundits, and authorities who were touted as trusted voices, who only offered war as a solution to a problem there was no evidence of. They never saw a day of accountability, and they've thrived in their careers, hawking about other wars. So what does a media that is so ingratiated with the military and foreign policy establishments need to do better? Is that even possible? Well, there's actually nothing wrong with there being opinion in news media. Analysis or commentary is a strong tool for helping navigate complex ideas, histories, policies, interactions. It can help us understand really what's at stake with all the various movements that take place in our world. The problem is when we create an economy of opinions in the news, when opinion becomes the primary way in which we understand what's happening. And that becomes dangerous when that opinion is presented without transparency about who's giving it and why. A large part of why this is so common is twofold. First, there's deference to establishment power that's inherent in the news media. Whether it's deference to the police or to the military, there's support for institutional power because the media itself is an institution and benefits from access to other institutions. Second, there's also just plain human bias, picking experts and commentators who conform to pre-existing biases on everything ranging from how the United States is a force for good to even biases about predictions on outcomes and behaviors. But audiences are entitled to hear from more perspectives from different parts of the world on an issue of global importance. They're entitled to full disclosure on the interests represented by the security experts discussing Russia or China or Iran or whoever. Ignoring different perspectives, treating commentary as the primary vessel for understanding major seismic events and not disclosing special interests guiding the commentary or pushing back against it also provides a lot of financial benefit to interested parties. Since the start of the Russian war in Ukraine, American weapons manufacturers have seen their profits significantly increase because war, violence, and general global instability is the bread and butter of the arms industry, which they happily acknowledge. And that money that these weapons manufacturers are pocketing is coming from the American taxpayer. So if an industry is built on the necessity of instability and its continuation, then why are those who work with and within that industry being used as authoritative voices that need to be heard from? There is so much need for accessible, earnest, and honest analysis of the movement of power in this world. Analysis that doesn't rely on hawkish narratives tied to financial interest, but rather puts the protection and elevation of human life at the center. Because anything else is just PR for those holding the guns pointed at us. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. So if you want a deeper dive into one of those instances where the media pundits, experts got it really, really wrong, check out our episode on the Iraq War and the media buildup that led us there. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll be back very soon.